Hello and welcome to the Northern Ireland podcast with your host Lily Busby. This week I am joined by Kate Mukungu, who did a doctorate looking at women's activism in post-conflict societies, where she has learned how women in Namibia and Northern Ireland have overcome the divisions around them to do their activism. In this episode, Kate will talk about her findings regarding Northern Ireland, but firstly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, and I want to say, Lily, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I think what you're doing is fantastic and I'm really happy to be part of it. My name is Kate Mukungu and I live in England, but you'll have probably gathered from my accent that I'm from the other side of the Irish Sea, and I work full-time as a community worker, and I have done for a really long time in Namibia and in Northern Ireland and in England where I am. And I did this research because it was an opportunity to reflect on a lot of the community work and activism that I had seen in my life. So that's why I did a doctorate.
And can you tell us a bit about the study you undertook?
I wanted to look specifically at women's activism around their human rights as women, particularly looking at violence against women and girls, because having worked in Belfast, having worked in Namibia, which was affected by apartheid in the same way that South Africa was, so it had a lot of division. And we know the division in Northern Ireland around sort of ethno-national identity, some people say religion or nationality. The reason I wanted to look at women's activism on violence against women and girls is that we know that, and it's a fact, that one of the things that will determine whether you have a good progressive response to violence against women and girls is if you have good activism in place, because it needs the activists to put the pressure on the government to put the right kind of responses in place. The way that I looked about answering it in both countries, Northern Ireland and Namibia, I did life history interviews with women activists. So I asked them to just tell me everything from the beginning up until now about the kinds of things you've done, who you've come together with, how you've come together with them, what have been the successes, what have been the challenges or the stresses, what's your own life been like, how has the country that you're in or the community that you're in changed throughout your life. And in that there was a mixture of older activists, younger activists, and activists from different kind of walks of life, if you like. So what I was interested in is that if you have places where traditionally people have been divided, and within that women have maybe been divided because of these bigger conflicts, how do women come together to be united in order to put that pressure on the government to respond the way they should to violence against women and girls? And as I look back on my own life, probably when I was working in Belfast, I think, gosh, were we paying enough attention? This was the early 90s. Were we paying enough attention to violence against women and girls? Because a lot of the violence we were worried about was more around political violence. And when I reflected on it, I thought, yeah, we weren't. That kind of violence, gendered violence, was very much in the backseat, if you like. And I had similar reflections when I was a community worker in Namibia, and probably because gender violence was taking more of a backseat to HIV and AIDS.
And what were some of your key findings?
The very strong things I was left with after hearing those amazing, I spoke to activists that would just inspire you and really energise you and just make you feel honoured to talk to them, to be honest with you. And the kinds of lessons I was left with, if you like, was how important the relationships that we have with each other are. And in fact, it's pivotal to whether you feel that you've got enough courage to go forward in activism. Isn't just about your own self. It's about how the relationships that you develop with other activists kind of give you that strength. And I saw that when I looked at all those stories and the life stories that I heard and started to really kind of pick things out, was the way that different activists talked about how important it was that they had relationships with people of different ages. So there were some of the older activists talking about how inspired they were by the courage and the bravery and how articulate some of the younger activists were. But I was also talking to younger activists who were saying, oh, I couldn't do this if I hadn't had time with that. And then they were naming activists who were older than them and how they really just, I looked at them and I thought they just get on with it and they don't let anything hold them back, and I wanted to be more like them. And I thought, wow, it's really proven to me about how the relationships you have, that's where the activism comes from, or the space in which the activism grows. And so although I was thinking about it originally in relation to crossing these traditional divides, with ethno-national divide in Northern Ireland, I think what I realised is that actually there's so many other divisions that people need to cross, and they're coming together in order to really unify around an issue, and that's around class, or also around the fact that the kind of ways that people are contained within their own communities is as much of a challenge as worrying about meeting people from other communities. It's actually being able to stand up proud in your beliefs in the place where you're in. It's not just about going out of that place and crossing over a division. And that's where the strong relationships between women seem to really come into their own, because quite a lot of women talked about people not wanting them to get too big for their boots. So that was the kind of phrase that came up a lot. So that's not something that you're facing because you're trying to enter another community. That's something that you're facing in your own community. You know, don't you be getting too big for your boots is a phrase that a lot of women told me that had been told to them. So I think one of the things that I learned from this research is that in the context of Northern Ireland, the good news is that activism is alive and well, and there are a lot of comings together between women, between lots of people concerned about human rights issues, and it's great to see it. But also, and whilst we know there are a lot of challenges, we know, for example, that in relation to violence against women and girls, conflict affects the way that violence takes place. Conflict also affects the lack of response, whether it's about decent policies, decent legislation, decent services, and Northern Ireland's playing catch up because of that. But when it comes to activists coming together and saying, look, this is what we need, and this is not good enough, and we need to do better, and we need to, centre the rights and the experiences of women and girls in that is definitely happening and happening in a really positive way. But what really interests me is if you could try and identify what makes that good stuff happen. How do you do that? Because there are so many countries and areas in the world that are being held back by conflict, where people are being affected by wider divisions in their society. And so that's why I looked at 2 countries and not just one. So whilst I've been talking to you just now about Northern Ireland, there were a lot of similarities in the themes that came up in the research. So for example, where there is conflict, the fact that women's rights and rights of girls are in the background and not in the foreground, and the fact that containment within communities can be as much of a problem as conflict between communities, and also the absolute importance of strong, empowering relationships between women activists. The more diversity that you can bring into those relationships in terms of age, in terms of class, perspective, worldview, that as challenging as that is, it's just ever so important. And I think we know that instinctively, but just hearing from the women that I interviewed kind of really, really, really confirmed that for me. It strengthened that conviction in me that I probably already had, but now I feel like I've got evidence that backs that up, not just from my life, but from the lives of the women that I interviewed.
Was there any of the responses that stood out to you?
All of them, that's the thing, because when you think of the fact that it's a life history interview and the entirety, people talking through all of the things that they were involved with, as much as you can in a single interview, because just like I'm telling you the things that occurred to me in this moment, the interviews that I would have had with activists were the same. They were telling me the things that were on their mind in that moment. But I guess from a point of view, so all of the women's experiences stood out to me, but I think it's more about the themes then that when you put them together, some of which I imagine might be the case and some of which I didn't expect. So I guess one of the surprises for me was the impact of containment within communities and kind of suppression within communities. I think I expected to hear more about the challenges that people experienced when they were trying to work across difference. And there were those challenges, don't get me wrong, but there was also a lot of commitment as well to do that. But some of the bravery that activists often had to show is much about standing up within their own community, and not just about working cross community, if you like. So that stood out to me.
There's practices that can be carried out to help safeguard activism when solidarity is strained. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So where there are strains in relationships, what I found is that activists, either individually or in the way that they kind of would develop their way of working within a group, will come up with lots of wee practices. So number one is, I'm going to avoid talking about this topic if I know it's not going to go somewhere in a way that's helpful to activism. But also different activists have talked about, how can we talk about our differences in a way that are respectful, but not that we're trying to convert each other into our way of thinking. And one way that people have done that is through working in collectives. So you might have individual groups, small groups, or organizations working on their own topic. But when there are things that are maybe a bit more controversial or a bit more challenging, actually, if we come together as a collective, we're not putting too much of a spotlight on any one of those groups or organizations. When we come together, we can agree that these are our priorities. These are the things that we've agreed that we're trying to achieve. But we don't have to all pretend that we're the same and that we think the same about everything in the world. But on these things that we're coming together on, we are united. So let's come together on that, and let's give each other space to be who we are outside of that as well. So I think there are times when topic avoidance can be justified if you know it's going to just go round and round in a circle and stop you from making progress. But also coming together as a collective allows you to focus on these where we think passionately about these issues. And if you're united on the thing that you are both engaged in, it then gives opportunities for other kind of forms of solidarity to grow. And people very much talked about how they were changed through activism, where maybe they hadn't previously thought so much about how class might impact on people's experiences. And for example, if you are experiencing a problem such as, a violation or the need for an abortion or something like that, how your class might have a big impact on your ability to respond to that problem the way that you would want. So I think a lot of people talked as well about how through the relationships that they formed allowed them to explore more about what solidarity means.
And do you think the different backgrounds could perhaps help with the activism?
I do, yeah. I mean, I don't want to come across as so idealistic where you're saying, it's all hands across the division and we'll all be fine. There are real challenges that can come from difference, but real solidarity is about actually using those differences in a positive way. But let's not pretend it's easy either.
One activist mentioned about how intersectionality informs what solidarity means to her. Was that a common thing your participants found?
Well, I mean, I suppose they were talking about their own lives. I think the word intersectionality has been used a lot more in the years since then. So whilst there was a few activists who talked about intersectionality as a real guiding principle for how they think about responding to injustice and responding to ensuring that people are included and centred in society, I think there were other activists who were demonstrating that, but maybe not using the language of intersectionality, but actually by the way they could show their understanding of different oppressions that people experience and that different women, girls and different groups experience. They were demonstrating it even if they weren't describing it.
You've sort of posed the idea of culture as a colonizer of women. Could you tell us more about that?
This was something that came up in both settings, and I think it's what I was saying about the idea of containment within communities. And it's about the idea of if there are oppressions happening within a community, but there's also this wider tension between communities. There's a pressure put on people, don't speak out against your own community because actually that's going to be used against us. You've got to show loyalty. I suppose it's less me framing culture as a colonizer of women, but it was more that different activists recognised that within their experiences. That definitely came out strongly in Namibia. And when you're in a place that's been colonised, which was true of, both places, we have these traditional views of what colonisation is, that it just happens between countries, but it happens within countries, it happens within groups. This idea of, well, I have a power over you and what your kind of choices and your freedoms are. And so the idea then that we don't do this because of our culture, or you don't speak out about that issue because of your culture. If it's used to silence women, then it is a form of colonisation. And I think there are lots of examples historically where that's been the case. But what I'm interested in is how women, in particular women and girls, have responded to that and challenged that. And they certainly have.
And how do you think the findings from your research will impact the future interventions aimed at addressing violence against women and girls in post-conflict societies?
Well, it's a great question. I think because I was looking at less at government responses to violence and more at how activists come together. I think for me, it's about learning that if we want societies to move on from conflict, we've got to support the activists and we've got to support the activists in their comings together. You've got to support at community level and at grassroots level those who have the relationships with the community and support them to come together. Now, we know that Northern Ireland's far behind in some of the responses around violence against women and girls. But if you want to know how to improve that, the people to speak to are the activists and those who have been working in communities and working with people affected by violence and oppression. So support them, and through supporting them, the better societal responses will follow.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the episode. Till next time, stay tuned and we'll talk later.